I call the Honourable Member Teria Ture.
Thank you.
Tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker, and thank you very much for the call. This bill has two purposes. The first is to remove the defence of right or the claim of right, which was what the Waihopai 3 used successfully when they, in their case. And I know that my colleague Keith Locke has talked at some length about the claim of right and why it needs to be retained. And he will do so again certainly during the committee stages. And I think it was quite remiss of the Minister of Justice not to make it plain in his speech earlier today, second reading speech, that this bill deals with two issues, quite different issues, not just one. Because any removal of the defence of right is an attack on the civil rights of citizens in this country, and that needs to be exposed, and the Green Party is absolutely opposed to removal of the civil rights of citizens in this country. National might think it's a great idea, but we believe that citizens are entitled to much more dignity and respect than that. The bill also increases criminal liability for adults who abuse children in a variety of there's a whole different range of provisions in this bill, some of which the Green Party agrees with, such as the provisions around grooming and increasing the offence around grooming, for example, sexual grooming. But we've always had a real concern about extending criminal liability to those outside of the household who have not been directly involved in child abuse and neglect. That's in the new clause 195A. And we echo many of the submissions made to the Select Committee that also suggested that actually there was a real issue here around the lack of certainty around who was captured by the definitions in this bill, the lack of certainty in the new laws, the uncertainty as to the degree of negligence, the standard of proof of negligence that was required, or act or omission or commission that was required in order to be subject to criminal liability, and the difficulty in providing protection for vulnerable family members who may well be aware of things that are going on but are not in any position to report that. As well, there were other submissions from those involved in the health profession who are very concerned about the criminal liability that might ascribe to them under the provisions of this bill. And it was echoed by the Association of Social Workers, by the Children's Commissioner, by a number of submitters who understand and agree with the intent, but do not feel that the law is sufficiently clear at this stage. And I'm not convinced yet that the Select Committee has made the changes that need to be made to make sure it is sufficiently clear so that those who should not have legal liability ascribed to them are protected from it. In addition, the Children's Commission at the time did also identify that the mandatory reporting, which is what essentially this provision does, that's been identified elsewhere globally, and particularly in Ireland, has not been proven to be effective in reducing child abuse or necessarily increasing the degree of reporting. So there is a real issue here around evidence that if there is going to be law change, particularly criminal law change, that is it has to be evidence-based. There has to be some proof that it will do what the intent of the bill does or wants to do, and there is none. So this legislation undertakes a major change in the criminal law without the evidence that it will actually work. Evidence-based law, particularly when it comes to crimes, is absolutely critical. So but that's not the only thing I want to talk about, because I do want to touch on some of the things that have been said earlier by other MPs this evening, and that is that while the desire to punish child abusers, people who beat and kill children, wife beaters, people who beat and kill their partners, while the desire to punish those people is palpable and real, and the law provides for that, it is not the only part of the story. And there were many submissions on this legislation that included lots of the stories, the more horrific stories that had gotten into the media in particular, of maltreatment, of child death, horrifying stories to justify support for this legislation. But again, they are not the only story. It is very easy to focus on the worst cases and to focus on the clear personal responsibilities of those who have acted cruelly against children, vulnerable children. But because it's only part of the story, unless we address the other part of the story, we are not going to deal with the child abuse that occurs in this country or deal with the drivers of abuse. And that is what I want to address tonight. As hard as it might be for the community to hear this, there is more to it. And we have to respond to these issues of child abuse and neglect and maltreatment not only as individuals and taking personal responsibility and holding people personally to account, but as a community and as an economy. There was an earlier discussion around the Child Poverty Action Report left further behind, which I have to say this is the report here that the Minister of Social Development has rubbished because she is irresponsible and refusing to acknowledge the evidence that is put before her about these issues. This report, significant report, goes into great detail, particularly around the link between poverty and violence. Now, they are very clear to say that on the evidence there is a link between poverty and violence against children. It is very hard to unpick the exact nature of the causality there, though. So it's not that poor people are bad people, it is that poverty is a driver of the conditions that tend to lead to violence and neglect. Child abuse is defined in that report as anything that individuals, institutions, processes do or fail to do that directly or indirectly harm children or damages their prospects for a safe and healthy future. It's not just individual cruelty here. We're talking about institutional neglect and disregard. And we can clearly put poverty, poor housing, poor education, poor health into the pool of drivers that come from institutional decisions made by institutions like this one, like Parliament, as to who gets what resources, which is often what the Parliament is making decisions about. So we have the Child Poverty Action Report that shows that link. We have the Every Child Counts report, Hiara Ho, which is about particularly focused on Māori and Pacific children, which also identifies that link. That poverty is behind many of the drivers of violence and maltreatment. I think it's also worthwhile noting, though, that what we're talking about here is if poverty is the driver behind maltreatment and neglect for many families, for many children, we are talking about the majority of children in those cases that are at risk. Whereas the legislation and the provisions, the criminal law legislations that are in this bill, deal with only a tiny fraction of the children that are at risk, and even then doesn't deal with it at all because it only deals with the perpetrators after the fact. So if we want to stop child abuse and neglect, we must deal with the drivers that that put the majority of children at risk, and which we can stop because we can alleviate poverty, we can eliminate poverty for our families. You know, one of the biggest causes of mortality that has a social gradient that's been shown by the Children's Social Health Monitor, just released a few weeks ago, is cot death. Cot death is one of the biggest contributors to mortality, to death of children in this country, driven by social issues around poverty. So if we want to protect the majority of children from death and injury, we must deal with poverty. It is the only solution. Incomes have to go up for beneficiaries and for the low-income working families. They must go up. Politicians don't want to deal with benefits, but benefits must increase. Housing provision must increase. The costs of housing have to be brought down because housing is a major driver of poverty in this country, and the quality has got to be improved because the drivers of the majority of kids who get social gradient issues around going to hospital are things like bronchitis and asthma that are often driven by living in cold, damp homes. We have to fix the housing crisis in this country. We have to make sure early childhood education is universally provided so that we can not only ensure our kids get access to the best quality education, but that we include all our families in our community. The drivers of violence include poverty. Poverty is the cause. Poverty is what we must eliminate.
I call the honourable member to Iraroa Flavel. Tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker, malo soifua, talofalawa, kia tātou katoa I tēnei pō. He pai e nei kōrero, Mr. Speaker, pai ki te whakarongo ki ngā take ko puta mai, ko tā mātou ko te kiatu, ko wai o tēnei wharepāre ma taka whakahei te hiehie, ki te tiaki o tātou tamoriki, mai te tūkino a tētahi atu, me tere whakatika I te ture kātika. Mr. Speaker, it's unlikely that any party would oppose the concept of placing proposals to protect children from assault, neglect and ill treatment on a faster track than was originally intended. Certainly that's not what I've heard tonight. No politician, no New Zealander, I would hope, could turn a blind eye to the wicked toll on our nation with respect to the horrific situations of abuse and neglect of our children. E ai ki tā te ao Māori, he taonga te tamaiti. According to Māori thinking at least, every child is a treasure, although sometimes we don't necessarily carry that out amongst some of our families. Every child deserves the protection of a safe home, a secure upbringing, a healthy life. And of course,